Hey friends, welcome back. What time is it where you are, and where are you watching from tonight? Go ahead and dim the lights, lie back, maybe turn on a fan or pull up a blanket, and let your shoulders drop. You wake up in the soft dark of a Greek night. The air is cool, the ground packed smooth beneath your feet, and somewhere beyond the door, a single torch crackles like a quiet fireplace. Stone holds the day's warmth in thin layers, ivy leans against a low wall, a clay cup waits on a shelf, its rim faintly resin-scented. You breathe in, slow and even, and step into a narrow lane where the world has already decided to whisper. Story 1: Footpaths of Ivy. You wake in early winter Attica to the slow hush of a village that keeps its own time. The roof smells of smoke and straw, and somewhere in the courtyard, a jar settles with a soft pop as the day's temperature shifts. You draw your cloak closer and step outside where the ground holds yesterday's damp, and the olive trees keep a dull light that never quite becomes morning. Vines have been cut back to their quiet bones. Sap sinks. Feet relearn where paths begin and where the hill forgets them. Tonight is the rural Dionysia. It does not begin with speeches. It begins with errands. Someone goes for ivy in the hedges, and someone must find the cart's missing peg. The headman worries about the borrowed ramhide that will be draped over the post, and the potter counts his cups, muttering that last year too many vanished after the Comos. You watch the rhythm of preparation, the ordinary decisions that make a procession feel inevitable later. A child writes letters in damp dust with a reed and erases them with a heel. Dogs nap near the kiln. A drummer tests a skin with the back of a fingernail and nods, satisfied by the dull reply. You take the lane to the goat pens and see ivy threaded through the fence. The leaves are waxy and cold. In the distance, a road bends through barley stubble toward another deme that will also hold a procession, a relay of small festivals stretched across the hills. News travels by feet and gossip. Which chorus tried a new song, whose wine was rough, who tripped in the rut by the threshing floor. You notice the tools set aside where pruning finished last week. A curved blade, a bundle of vine ties, a wicker pannier still dusted with cane shavings. Someone has chalked a tally on the stable door, jars filled, jars sealed, jars opened and tasted. In the storage room, you run a finger along the lip of a jar sealed with pitch. The smell is sharp, resin and sour grape, the practical perfume of preservation. A neighbor jokes that Dionysus loves a good seal because it gives him something to break, and the room answers with gentle laughter. This is not the roaring city festival by the theater. That will come in spring, with judges, actors, and rows of people. Here in winter, the rural Dionysia keeps to the scale of the lane. Masks wait on a shelf, their mouths permanently open, ivy crowns stacked like quiet baskets. By afternoon, the cart is declared sound enough. One wheel lacks a spoke, but nobody minds. A wooden post rises from the bed, wrapped in linen, then ivy, then a ribbon the color of watered wine. In the city, they sometimes roll a ship on wheels to show the gods' sea passage. Here the road is narrow, and a cart can turn around without strangers to lift its tail. You tie a sprig of ivy to your wrist. It leaves a cold print that will warm only when you forget it is there. Someone brings dried figs strung on twine. Someone else a small basket of barley cakes. The gathering begins without a signal. Someone starts a tune that is little more than a drone and feet a line. Children look around as if trying to find the exact line where celebration begins, but there is only walking. The headman carries the small jug and you carry the funnel. Two women adjust their hair and the pins at their cloaks. They will lead a short hymn when the path enters the grove. There is no hurry. The road teaches the pace, and the pace teaches the breath. You pass the well, the kiln, the threshing floor, and let the village measure itself by the length of your steps. The grove waits ahead, not very large, mostly oak and a few pines, with a stony shelf where shepherds leave milk in spring. Tonight there will be a simple rite, a libation poured, a crust of bread dipped in wine and set on a flat rock, a few lines sung to a melody everyone knows, but nobody can fully recall when asked. You notice how the path takes a small dogleg around an old stump, and how that curve makes it impossible to see more than a few paces forward. The bend is where the village stops being a map and becomes the act of walking. Torches are lit, and smoke tastes of resin and damp bark. The ivy on your wrist warms, skin remembering to be skin. A cup passes backward, then forward again, tilting for sips rather than gulps, and the tune holds. The words are not grand. They are a list of thanks and a request for weather when it matters, a reminder to keep vines tied and fences mended, a hope that new jars will not crack. This is how Dionysus keeps company with getting lost, not by terror, but by granting permission for edges to blur while duties remain. You think of other hills where similar paths turn around similar stumps. On Cythera, they say Theban women climb at night every second year, torches hissing in snow, and there the music is sharper, the cold its teacher. Near Delphi, Theiads go up Parnassus in deep winter to honor the god among pines. But you are in Attica, and your feet know these stones. The cart creaks, the song wanders, and someone laughs because a goat has decided to follow as if invited. A boy climbs into the cart's bed and pretends to steer the post as if it were a mast. At the grove's edge, the headman lifts the jug. Cups are filled, bread offered, the first words spoken. The wind brings an owl's single note and lets it hang over the gathering like a thread. You notice you can no longer locate your house by memory of turnings. The torches rearrange the map. The familiar distance between fence and mill, between road and field margin, softens until you are not certain whether the grove sits east of the well or west. You do not worry. The festival teaches safe forgetting and careful return. When the hymn pauses, you hear the steady clack of a staff against rock, and an old woman sings a couplet you have not heard in years. It is small, about ivy not minding snow and about goats finding water under frost. The lines land and stay. People nod without speaking. The cart settles as if listening. You think of sealed jars back home, lids that pop in the shifting night, and of how a god who blesses wandering also lives in discipline, pruning, sealing, waiting. If getting lost is a craft, where does it end? At the grove, at the lane, or somewhere your feet have not yet named? And what path will the night quietly redraw for you alone now? The hymn releases you back into the ordinary work of a winter night, and the ordinary work reshapes itself into festival. Cups are topped with wine cut from the jug and lengthened with water from a skin left near the rock shelf. Someone lifts a shallow bowl to show a child the pale meniscus and names the measures aloud. 1 to 3, 2 to 5, more lesson than merriment. If the god blesses forgetting, the village blesses proportion. A crater would be grander, but the bowl is enough. You drink and find the taste simple. A memory of sun, a hint of resin at the rim, a clean finish that asks for bread. The cart stands in profile by the grove, the post wrapped and ribboned, ivy dark against linen. In Athens, you've heard, the cart can become a ship on wheels at springtime, an emblem of arrival by sea, the god who comes over water to the city's stone harbor. Here, arrival is by lane, a post, a wheel with a weak spoke, and hands steady enough to keep the turning easy. The month is Posidean on the Athenian calendar, the short days when vines are trimmed and fields wait. A fitting time for the rural Dionysia, a festival scaled to what the village can lift. You step aside to watch the small chorus gather, half a dozen neighbors with ivy circlets and goat-patterned mantles, one keeping time with a stick. They do not stage a play, those belong to the city Dionysia in Elaphebolion with judges and rows of benches, but they do shape their singing. The melody spirals around a refrain. There is a joke about a stingy neighbor who waters his wine too far. There is praise for a fine harvest in a Demes valley 2 ridges away. The rhythm is narrow and unhurried, like the road itself. It is not the dithyramb of the great choruses, but its smallness is not a fault. The scale is the message. A basket of ivy crowns is passed, and you take one. The leaves cool your forehead. A woman knots a nebrous goatskin across her shoulder, not as theater but as clothing stored for the purpose, patched after many winters. The village's wealth in animals lines up quietly here, hides cured and recured, hooves saved for glue, dung for fuel at the kiln. Even at a festival, resourcefulness is the nearest altar. On a flat stone, the headman breaks a cake of barley and dips the crust into the bowl. He places a piece on the rock and says the god's name in a low, practical tone, as if asking a neighbor to keep an eye on the fence. When the singing turns to procession again, you feel the shift from place to path. The cart noses back into the lane. Torches lift and make the closest leaves gold and the far ones absent. The Comos, wandering revel, will be gentle here, no more than a string of people moving house to house. Doors open to receive the song and return it with a cup, a fig, a nod. The verses are brief and forgiving. At the weaver's gate there is a teasing couplet about tangled warp. At the potter's yard, a promise that the next firing won't crack. Small mockery is a tune that keeps the wheels true. You add your voice where the refrain permits. Outside one courtyard, a pole rises at the gate, a carved shape at its top that earns a few shy grins. It is the phallic emblem recorded in old descriptions, half joke and half charm, a sign that growth has its place even in winter. A boy glances, then away, as children have always done in the presence of adult mysteries that are ordinary in one register and strange in another. A woman ties ivy to the pole's base, as if to teach the wood patience. Not far off, a dog finally exhausts its curiosity about the cart and curls into a dark comma by the wall. All the while, the path is remeasured by feet in the dark. That, you notice, is where Dionysus keeps his quiet rule, where the village stops being its map and becomes a series of reach and return gestures. You know these fields by day by their ownership and fences. Now you learn them by who will answer a song, who keeps extra cups by the door, who offers water before wine. To be lost here is to have your usual bearings replaced by a network of hospitality. The god does not command you to forget. He allows you to remember differently for one night, with consequences as homely as refilled jugs and thawed hands. A neighbor murmurs about Cytheron, where Theban Thales place the god among winter torches, and about Parnassus, where Theiads climb at night to honor him. But you remain on Attic ground, and your climb is the low rise from one threshing floor to another. The comparisons, like the songs, are scaled. You wonder how many demes in Attica do the same tonight, dozens, perhaps, and how the festival moves across the countryside like a small fire line, never large enough to alarm, always warm enough to gather. There is a lesson in the wine itself. Each door offers it slightly different, one more resinous from the pitch, another with a tartness that speaks of a jar sealed too late, a third mellow from careful mixing. Every cup is diluted, mixing is part of the rite. The word for hubris could be written on a cup left undiluted, not as law, but as thought. A man jokes that the god who unbinds also loves knots, the ties on vine canes, the bands that hold a wineskin tight, the binding of sandals before a long walk. You think of pruning, cut in winter so that growth will be true, not noisy. Masks from the storehouse appear, not for performance but for play, a satyr face with a chipped ear, a woman's mask with painted brows rubbed thin. A teenager tries one on, and seeing nothing but torch light and the cart's post through the eye slits, walks into a bush. Laughter tumbles out and is set down softly again. Wearing a mask in the lane is different from wearing it on stage. Here, anonymity is not for drama, but for relief. The chance to carry a tune in someone else's face for a few minutes, to tease without offense. You try one and feel your breath change as it hits the wood and bounces back warm. At the last house, a widow waits with a pot of warm water. She pours a little into the communal bowl and tips it, steaming, into the wine to take the edge off the chill. Someone says the god has arrived. Someone else replies that he never really left. He was sleeping in the seal of the jars. The stars are thin. You try to place the sound of the night insects and cannot. They are there, then not. Like a tessellation, the dark keeps rearranging. When the procession turns toward the grove again, the road feels slightly longer, as if the hill had gained one more fold while you were away. The cart creaks exactly as before. The ribbon on the post has slipped an inch. A torch gutters and is replaced. The hymn returns to its first lines without anyone deciding to begin. You arrive at the stone shelf, where a small offering has sunk into its own stain, and find your steps measuring the same ground in a new way. Departure stitched to return by song, a loop tightened at the knot by shared breath. Tomorrow, vines will still be dormant, fences will still need mending, and the month will still be short. Tonight is the practice that makes tomorrow possible, a rehearsal for losing and finding, for giving and taking back, for turning the village's edges blurry enough that they can be redrawn without tearing. You look down at the ivy on your wrist, now warm, and wonder, when the torches are out and the lane is only a lane again, will you remember the way by habit, or by something the god has quietly retired within you, invisible but strong? The torches thin to breaths, and the grove regains its edges, oak on the left, a stony shelf on the right, a path compacted by hooves and sandals. Someone tightens the cord on a wineskin, someone pinches a wick to an orange bead, and someone pours a last measure into the bowl. You place a palm against the cart's post. The linen is warm from many hands. The ribbon, damp with mist, sticks to your knuckles and leaves a faint chill when you lift them away. A closing offering is made without flourish. Crumbs of barley, a sliver of goat's cheese, a stripe of honey that glows until it darkens, then a tilt of cold water to follow wine. The words are ordinary, almost conversational. Keep the knots that hold the canes, keep the seals true, bless the fences that meet weather, let vines sleep well. The god of loosening, they say, favors those who know when to bind. It is instruction disguised as thanks, practice wrapped as prayer. You begin the way back with the simple decision to walk. The lane is again a sequence: wall, ditch, hedged fig, the kiln's domed shadow, yet the bearings are different. The night has taught your eyes a slower geometry, and the village answers by becoming a set of relations rather than points. You are lined by smoke from a courtyard, by the hollow ring underfoot where the ground hides a tile shard, by the small rise where wagon ruts deepen after rain. The map thickens into texture. The cart pauses at the headman's gate. Ribbons are rolled and tied with neat knots, ivy crowns unhooked and stacked in a shallow basket. The post, stripped of its green, is simply a post again, plank joins, a dowel smoothed by years of use, a peg now missing. A boy tallies the cups that left and returned. A girl wipes the jug's lip with a thumb and saves the sweetness for a crust. Inventory quiets the evening. Masks go back onto their shelf, mouse-nibbled edge toward the wall. In the storeroom, jars keep their low, patient silence. You run your finger along a rim and feel the thin seam of pitch that turns time into a collaborator. It is a small barrier that teaches waiting, like a door latch that clicks nightly. Festivals become manuals when they end. The rural Dionysia teaches a grammar of return. Dilute what is strong, sing so feet remember, leave a marker you can find by touch. Forget a little, then, with practice, unforget. Voices drift in the lane about Athens and spring. When the city Dionysia will fill the theater and poets, names will carry across benches. That city scale contains a different lesson: how to become a crowd and breathe together. Here, the village scale keeps you domestic and durable. It shows how public life is built from private seams, the patched nebris, reheated water, the timely joke at a weaver's gate that repairs frictions without decree. Both scales honor the god. The last shared task is to return each person to a door. It happens by simple means. You call to a cousin, she answers from left, and you correct by a pace. A man names the dog by the kiln and hears the thump of its tail, a sound that draws a line. Two women place a palm against the same leaning fig and agree this is the narrowing where the lane remembers to be careful. Orientation tonight becomes dialogue rather than certainty. At your threshold you pause. The ivy on your wrist is warm, faintly fragrant, a little crushed. You untie it and hang it from a peg beside the basket of figs. The reed mat whispers beneath your toes. The hearth holds a muffled red. Somewhere in the rafters, a jar settles with a pop, like a knuckle acknowledging work completed. You pour water into a cup and sip the cool taste that lay under wine all evening, unnoticed, like the lane under the song. You think of the phrase the village will use tomorrow: we went out and came back. It will sound like nothing, but it contains a method. Go out together, mark the path with a chorus and a cup. Allow the map to blur just enough to learn it twice. Return with fewer things so your fingers remember to open. If Dionysus is the god of being lost, he is equally the god of return, and a circle calmly walked is one of his favored structures. Before you sleep, you picture other ridges and other winters. Cithran's torches in snow, Parnassus pines sighing under bright moon, villages along the megarid lighting their small braziers. The terrain differs, but the craft is shared. People need training in uncertainty, so they hid it in festivals. They made occasions to practice letting edges soften and then be redrawn. They taught children how much water to mix with wine, not to curb delight, but to pace it into endurance. Centuries will pass, roads will straighten and bright lamps will smudge the constellations. Maps will live in pockets and speak without being asked. Even then, people will still wake disoriented in familiar rooms. They will still meet nights where a wall leans differently than expected or days when measures shift underfoot. In those moments, the old craft persists. Count the cups, tie the ribbon, dilute what is too strong, name the dog by the kiln, walk with others until the lane remembers you. You lie down and let the room quiet into a patient grove. The hearth becomes a low torch, and the mat under your shoulder is packed earth. Tomorrow, the ribbon will wait on its peg, the cart will be a cart, and the vines will keep their winter silence. Somewhere beyond sight, the god keeps walking, not to lead you astray, but to show how a life can wander without breaking, and how a path relearned at night can hold in daylight like a calm, continuous thought. Story 2. The Night on Cithaeron. It's cold in the stone room before dawn, and the cold shapes your decisions. You wrap a wool himation tight and check the sandals, thongs, pulling each knot until it stops your thumb. In Thebes, the Cadmea sleeps in a darker hush than the plain, and you step out with other women whose breath makes brief clouds in the courtyard lamplight. A basket of torches waits by the door, fennel stalks dried and packed, tips wrapped in resin and pine. Someone lifts a goatskin, the nebris, patched over seasons, not as costume but as windbreak. Tonight the mountain Cithaeron will set the measure. The city, for a while, will recede to a gate and a distant row of roofs. The way to the lower slopes is a string of practicalities. No one hurries. You carry an oiled leather bottle of water and separate a small flask of wine. You also carry quiet rules that have been told and retold. Keep together at the turns. Do not outrun the torchlight. If a strap fails, sit and retie rather than limp. You will make better time with warm feet than with proud speed. A thyrsus, a fennel staff wound with ivy and capped with a pinecone, feels light in the hand, more walking stick than symbol when the ground has frost. The women who know the path best take front and rear. Girls and the less sure walk in the middle where the light is thickest. Cithaeron is both boundary and teacher. It separates Boeotia from Attica like a long ridged wall, but its lessons are small. Where water hides under rock, where a fallen oak makes a windbreak, where the path skirts a hollow that keeps last week's snow. Shepherds' marks help piled stones at an angle, a split branch left pointing, but so do stories. Names hang on folds of land. The turn called the goat's hesitation, the slab up ahead known as quiet drum because staffs sound hollow on it. The map is not drawn. It is narrated, walked, and revised with each season's damage. You think of how Athens in spring makes a ship on wheels to honor the god who comes over water. Thebes has this winter path. The Dionysus honored here is not the splendid guest arriving to applause, but the companion of careful wandering. Ancient writers call his cycle triteric, the third year round, in counting that folds 2 winters inside one number. The timing fits the land's biology. Vines sleep, fields rest. The mountain opens under moon and frost and lets a procession of women learn its grammar again. At the first stopping place, a low shelf of rock that breaks the wind, you unwrap the torches. A woman named for her grandmother sets the rhythm, scrape, twist, light, scrape, twist, light. Resin smokes blue for a moment, then steadies to a usable yellow. The leader checks. 1 torch for every 3 people is the rule that keeps hands free for the steeper pitch ahead. You take a sip of water first, a sip of wine second, and fold a piece of bread in your palm so it will not harden. No one speaks about gods in the high register yet. You speak about ankles and the weather and the exact place where the path threads between 2 stands of scrub pine. The mountain's rule is not a law. It is a set of constraints that make safety. Don't cut straight up a slope. You'll burn your legs and lose your footing. Take the zigzag the shepherds placed with their sheep in mind. Don't pass a torch forward without saying a name. The light should have a known destination. Don't stamp at the resting places. The frozen ground will answer with a crack that carries farther than you intend. If a torch dies, warm the next wick under your cloak before you ask your neighbor for fire. The rituals embedded in these instructions are not separate from worship. They are worship, body. Somewhere above, wind slides downslope in slow sheets. You taste it in the bit of cold that finds the gap at your collarbone and learn to angle your shoulders to cheat it. At a second shelf, where the view opens west toward Plataea's country, you stop, face one another, and share a low chant that holds breath steady. It is not Euripides' thundering theater. It is a pattern of vowels that settles feet. The refrain names the ivy that doesn't mind snow, the pinecone that keeps seed tight until the fire asks. The words are practical botany sung as prayer. From the city come tales, some pious, some troubling, about nights on this mountain. The myth of Pentheus sits in everyone's mind like a warning disguised as drama, a king who tried to see what was not his to govern and paid for the curiosity with ruin. You don't reenact the myth, you maintain a craft it dramatized. Theban households plan around this night openly. Some men walk with you to the first rise and then turn back to tend children and animals. Others will wait at known resting stones on the return to lend an arm where the slope buckles. Not secrecy, but respect for roles keeps the path clear. On a sheltered ledge, someone leaves an offering for the god that looks like supplies for a long chore: a ball of cord, a knife with a worn handle, a small jar of pitch. The intention isn't esoteric. It's a recognition that Dionysus blesses knots as much as he blesses release. He lives in the binding of sandals and the sealing of jars, as much as in song and sway. If the mountain teaches anything, it is that loosening without prior binding is only waste. Higher up, frost thickens. You mark the breath of those before you by the gleam on rock where their exhale kissed the stone. Stride shortens. The pitch of talk lowers to protect air. The leader points with a thyrsus tip at a dark patch to avoid, or have churned the ground they're looking for roots, and hoof holes in freeze make ankle traps. Someone names the star that peaks between two bare branches. Another, older, shakes her head and says not to trust thin sky peaks for direction. Trust, she says, the ground you know plus the last good mark you remember. The advice has been repeated so often it no longer has an author. When the slope softens, you gather in a hollow a little below the ridge. You place torches in a rough circle, tips inward so the smoke climbs and cold air falls to the edges. A thin wine is mixed in a clay bowl, and everyone takes only a mouthful. Snow lies in folded strips in the grasses. Someone covers a patch with a goatskin to make a seat for the oldest. If a song rises here, it is the old one again, an unshowy lift of notes that rides the breath and drops without echo. You notice your hands shaking less than your first winter. The body remembers the mountain's cadence with relief. In the circle, the talk turns to the city's calendar. There will be Agrionia in nearby towns at another season, with its own thorny customs. There will be the Daedala on these slopes in Hera's honor, when wooden brides are carried and burned, another kind of mountain memory. Cithaeron holds many stories layered like thin ice over moving water. Tonight you place one more layer. A winter night walked carefully, a god honored by knowing where to turn, and a group taught once again that being lost can be a controlled condition made safe by method. You look toward the ridge where the wind sounds like cloth being folded and think about the return you haven't begun. Paths are easier to recognize on the way down, people say, but snow changes edges and torchlight shortens the world. When the circle thins and torches are lifted again, which landmark will be the first to look unfamiliar? A boulder that seems nearer than before, a tree whose shadow leans a new way, or the city itself sitting differently on the plain. The circle holds its heat in a modest way, like a slow kettle that never quite boils. You loosen the himation, flex your toes inside the sandals, and find the rhythm that keeps blood obedient in cold. Bread passes hand to hand, a fig shared into quarters, a sliver of goat's cheese that tastes of salt and smoke. The bowl of wine returns, thinned on purpose. 1 to 3, sometimes 1 to 4, so breath stays even and steps keep their reason. Someone pinches a line of resin from a pouch and rubs it along a torch shaft where the bark frays. The gesture is half maintenance, half prayer. Talk is low and practical. If a thong breaks, do not hobble, sit, rethread, test, then rise. If your torch gutters, shelter the wick under cloth for a count of 20 before seeking a neighbor's flame. Do not trust snow for silence. It can carry a snapped twig farther than bare stone. Pair each new walker with an old path keeper. Count names, not heads. Names are harder to misplace. These rules have the patina of worship because they are repeated on sacred nights, but they would serve just as well on a morning to mark it. On Cithaeron, piety and craft shake hands. Someone hums the vowel pattern again, and the air untenses. The Theosoi rest upright, pinecones glistening a little where sap has bled and caught torchlight. You think about the gods' names and how each reveals a different scale. Bromios for the raw, which tonight is reduced to breath. Dendrites for the tree, standing now as staff and pine. Linites for the windwing basket, a household tool that speaks of measured movement. The frenzy that poets love can be a scholar's fiction when feet must find exact places on frozen ground. Here, ecstasy is a carefully dilated attention. A woman tells a story about her mother's winter ascents. Wool doubled at the ankle, hair braided low to keep pins from catching on brush, ivy crown worn not as ornament, but as a reminder to keep the head cool. Another remembers when a boar cut the path 2 winters ago and how the line formed without order. Women shoulder to shoulder, Theosoi forward, torches tilted just enough to sting eyes and drive the animal downslope. The story ends not with triumph, but with inventory: 2 torn hems, One bruised knee, no one lost. The god, they say, is kind to those who count. You look out across the Boeotian plain. Thebes makes a dark block, a geometry felt more than seen. Farther west, a scatter of lights suggests farms toward Plataea. Someone points to a paler strip where the river Asopos takes moon. Another marks the notch that leads to the Plataean road used for the Daedala, the festival in Hera's honor when wooden brides are carried and burned, and the mountain is clothed in a different kind of procession. Cithaeron holds festivals like layers of thin cloth. Each lays over the last and warms it a little. The winter tritoris of Dionysus is one layer among many. The circle stirs, torches are lifted, their tips turned slightly inward until a leader breathes the word to go. You file out in the practiced order, sure feet at front and rear, the uncertain cushioned in the middle where light is thick and decision is shared. When the line moves, it becomes a lesson in packing. A steep pitch teaches zigzag, a level stretch allows talk to restart and then fade without resentment. You notice how staff tips explore rock before weight commits, how each left-right decision asks nothing grander of the night than consent. Above the ridge, a wind organizes itself into bands, each a little colder than the last. Your skin learns timing, count 6 breaths, brace for the next slide of air, let the himation billow enough to catch warmth again. On a narrow traverse where the path holds to a seam in the slope, the rule against passing a torch forward without a name becomes important. Philistor, someone says, and a flame moves exactly one place. A head turns, the name is returned, and the light joins a new hand. In this way, the procession behaves like a woven cloth. Threads cross, and the pattern holds. You stop where the ground darkens with bulwark frozen pits, set irregularly like a careless paving. The leader taps each hazard with her thyrsus and calls them aloud. You repeat the names under your breath to keep balance obedient. No one lectures about Pentheus here, yet the myth stands nearby like a boundary stone. The king who tried to manage what was not his learned the mountain's other lesson. If you will not be taught by proportion, you will be taught by consequence. The line steps through the churned ground one by one, and you feel how instruction is safer than warning. A broader shelf allows a longer pause. Here, the city drops away, and the mountain briefly becomes world enough. You set the torch's butt down, tips slanted toward one another to pool heat. Hands open to it, then close. The oldest traveler takes the goatskin seat. Those nearest adjust the hem of her himation so her ankles do not drink cold from stone. Bread again, water again, a mouth of wine. Someone ties a fresh strip of ivy to a thyrsus, the leaves dull and tough from frost. The chant lifts, 3 lines this time, scarcely louder than talk. The refrain praises wandering that returns, not wandering that dissolves. You feel the relief of a definition that does not ask you to become other than you are. In that quiet, context arranges itself like tools on a bench. You remember the Delphic Thyiads who climb Parnassus in winter to honor the god among pine, and you are glad your ground is nearer, your path familiar. You recall the Agrionia in nearby towns, a festival with its own thorny customs about pursuit and refusal. It teaches boundaries by pretending to test them. Across the Greek world, the god's calendar redraws maps in different inks. In Thebes tonight the ink is this frost, these rules, this measured song. Cloud begins to write on the ridge. What was merely a wind becomes a presence that shows itself in the dimming of stars at the seam of sky and rock. A light the color of ash walks across the plain where the river turns. The leader watches the change as if reading someone's handwriting. We will turn before the saddle, she says, and the decision hangs long enough for everyone to feel what it means. Less view, more margin for the descent, while the torches are good and the path still remembers your feet. There is no disappointment, only a retasking of attention. You tighten the thongs at the instep where leather has stretched with heat. You bring the torch close to a new wick and wait for the small, stubborn bead to accept flame. You rehearse in your mind the hazards below, the bulwark already crossed, the hollow called quiet drum, the traverse that favors left feet, the slab where staffs sound hollow. Someone suggests a staggered start to reduce the chance of rolling stones onto neighbors. The leader nods. The god of loosening, it turns out, loves order enough to make release safe. You take your place, the line angles down, and the world shortens to a cone of light whose rim frays quickly. Marks you trusted on the way up feel moved a hand's breadth to the left, as if the mountain had shifted its furniture while you sang. A boulder that sat beyond arm's reach now lurks near your knee. The The city, was it there an inch lower before, seems to have slid along the plain. You glance back to find the next name before passing on Flame, and in that small delay feel the mountain's old question tap your shoulder. When the ridge writes and rewrites its lines in cloud and wind, and when the plain below rearranges its lights to an unfamiliar pattern, which sign will you trust first? The last good mark you remember, the voice that says your name, or the small grammar your own feet have learned tonight? The turn comes where the ridge leans away and the track dips, and with the turn the world folds small again. Torches tilt, names pass forward, Philister, and Flame travels the distance of one human reach. Descent is not the reverse of ascent, it is its own craft. Stones that were steps become levers, grass that was friendly becomes glass, snow that helped your footing earlier hardens into a sheet that wants your heel. The rule you practiced, short stride, soft knee, staff first, returns like a tune you didn't know you'd memorized. The leader names the hazards before they arrive and you repeat them, a litany that fixes depth into language. Traverse seam, bulwark, quiet drum, goat's hesitation. The theosoi, which looked ceremonial at the circle, are now walking sticks that find edges before your weight does. A torch guttering near the middle of the line is nursed back to steadiness under a cloak. A wick takes fire at the second try, the little bead of pitch finally conceding to become flame. The wind has softened, or perhaps your skin has learned it. Either way, your breath no longer startles you with cold. At the Borchern patch, the line opens and compresses like a lung, each body giving and taking room until everyone is past the ankle traps. No one hurries. What saves time is the absence of mistakes. A stone rolls under someone's heel and is caught by two sticks at once. A hand goes to a forearm not with panic, but with habit. You realize that you have been taught, across one winter night, a grammar of shared movement that would embarrass anyone who tried to write it down as law, and yet here it is, binding as a sealed jar. Below, a strip of plain begins to show where the Asopos turns in its winter bed. The city's block gathers back into a geometry, not because it has moved, but because you have. Pauses are chosen with the same prudence as before, a shelf that breaks wind, a rock that remembers your staff's hollow knock. Bread is not offered now, water is. The wineskin stays tied until the last pause near the lower pines, and then only a mouthful for the oldest hands, a quiet thanks to the one who kept names counted under her breath. Stories come out in a low, practical way at rests made shorter by cold. Someone mentions the Daedala again, the Hera festival that teaches the mountain another order when wooden brides are carried and burned. Someone else remembers an Agrionia in a neighboring town when the old story of pursuit and refusal was told too sharply, and the magistrate had to remind the crowd that custom protects, not provokes. Myths live on the ridge like boundary stones. Customs are the paths that reach them and then return without injury. You will head down along a custom today. Light thickens, but not into day yet. The mountain writes in gray, torches shorten. The leader looks at each head, not for identity but for posture, upright enough, not stiff, feet placing where eyes intend. The rule about passing fire with a name holds even when the city begins to feel near. Last minutes breed carelessness. At the traverse seam the line becomes a woven band again, each torch an intersection, each staff a warp that keeps weight in place. You say two names, one forward, one back, and hear both return, little receipts that the cloth still holds. At the last pause, where frost gives way to damp soil, the torches are grounded in a circle and snuffed, not blown. Smoke rises and curls into the resin of the pines. The leader unwinds a length of ivy from her thyrsus and ties it around a young trunk at shoulder height. The leaves dull from cold. It is not a marker for anyone else. It is a promise to the path itself. Next winter, she says, we'll see whether this knot still remembers us. The group answers with a sound that is not quite a word. The slope softens into lanes. Piled stones become walls. The distance between pauses lengthens. Dogs bark and resolve into individual dogs. One dashes out, circles, recognizes, and escorts with a dignity it did not show last summer. Men who walked with you to the first rise in the night reappear at agreed places, each with a small job. A hand at a muddy corner, a steadying grip over a root, a word to count the last names in. Feet remember the ground's old grammar and are grateful not to have to learn a new one. Gates receive you not with surprise but with ready work. Torches are laid on a bench and scraped of pitch where it has blistered. Shafts are smoothed with a bit of pumice. Wicks are trimmed to their next useful inch. Thiasoi are inspected for cracked wood. Pinecones turn to see which scales have loosened and need binding. Nebrides, the goatskins, are dried and combed. Someone counts the names again, very softly. Someone else sets warm water to a trickle so cold feet will accept it without numbness turning to pain. Bread appears because hands need occupation that doesn't fray. In private rooms, ivy is unknotted and hung on pegs to dry. Hair is loosened and combed from low braids that kept pins from brush. Sandal thongs are drawn through finger and thumb to find thinning spots before they yield in a bad place. There is talk of the month ahead in the city's calendar, of weaving to finish, of jars to seal with fresh pitch, of the spring festivals that remake crowds in another key. Cytheron's lesson will sit inside those as a quiet layer, an instruction in careful wandering that gives structure to the season's larger arrivals. You think of Pentheus one last time, not as a warning shouted from a stage, but as a mistake solved by this night's method, the desire to look without belonging, to manage without being taught. The mountain punishes that habit. The custom you have practiced corrects it. You were not invited to dissolve. You were invited to walk rules that make return certain. That is a different and steadier kind of surrender. Centuries invite themselves into the thought. Roads will one day be cut clean through this ridge. Soldiers will pass where songs were. In time, travelers will come to look for a myth they think is here and miss the customs that held it in place. But the craft persists in other forms, in the way a fire line moves through a forest with names and spacing, in the way a night hike is led with count and pace, in the practiced dilution of strong things so they can be shared safely. Cities will learn to manage crowds with lessons first rehearsed in torchlight on frost. The gods, loosening, will be found, for the prudent, inside well-tied knots. You lie down later in a room that has resumed its boundaries. Sleep comes without overture. The path is in your legs and will be there in the morning as a friendliness towards steps that match ground. If you wake briefly in the dark and cannot locate yourself, a small grammar answers, shorten stride, find a name, remember the last good mark, trust the knot you tied before beginning. The mountain says nothing more mysterious than that. It is enough. In the doorway, the thyrsus leans clean against the wall and the goatskin dries by gentle heat. Ivy on the peg darkens as it gives back its cold. Outside, the ridge is already erasing your footprints with a thaw you won't see. Tomorrow your feet will take streets that seem straight after such folding ground, and the city will feel less like a trap and more like a pattern you can read. When you next find yourself lost in a room or a thought, will you remember to look first for the last good mark, or for a voice that says your name, or for the small rules your own feet learned on Cytheron tonight? Story 3, Icarios and the First Wine. You wake in Attica's northeast, where the low hills around Icaria keep the night a little longer than the plain. The yard holds the ordinary inventory of a small farm, 2 pithae sunk to their shoulders in packed earth, a linos press with its beam asleep, wicker baskets leaning like tired shoulders against a wall. A dog named Maera lifts her head at your step and sets it back again, unconcerned. Inside, Eragon's loom waits with a weft left mid-row, the shuttle tucked into the warp like a held breath. The air smells of olives and damp clay. The day will be for pruning, for tying last year's canes to new pegs, for bringing order before sap begins to think of rising. He arrives the way such figures always do in old stories, without explanation, carrying the right tools as if they were only luggage. A stranger in travel-worn clothes, goat hair cloak salt-dusted from older roads, a fennel staff polished by hand sweat rather than ceremony. He asks for water and a place in the shade, and you bring both without accounting. That is how farms work on roads that go anywhere. His eyes take in the yard the way a carpenter reads grain. When you speak of vines, he listens like a neighbor with time. When you show him the trellis that bowed under fruit 2 summers ago, he touches the crosspieces and names the weaknesses without judgment. What he teaches comes disguised as chores. Cut here, not there, leave the spur at 2 buds, train the cane along the sun, not against it. He points to a graft scar and shows you how to bind with bast so it holds but does not choke. He moves to the linos and runs a finger along the trough where juice will travel. Clean this with hot water now, he says, and pitch the seam where clay meets wood so no sourness stays from last year's hurry. He does not name himself. He names tools, measures, and timings, all the nouns that make a harvest into a method. When grapes are ready, those small, tight clusters that Attic heat makes tough-skinned and sweet, he sets bodies to work without speechifying. Feet wash. Baskets are penned into the press. The first juice runs free, a pale rush that looks like water asking permission to become something else. The stranger tells you to save that free run in a separate jar. The rest will come under the beam. People move in the pattern that production draws when it is well led. Treading, carrying, skimming the rougher shred away from the smoother must, pouring through a reed strainer that keeps stems from clogging the lip. A boy with steady hands holds the kyathos and counts ladles into a tall pithos. His numbers ride the day like a low chant. You learn fermentation by nose before you learn it by sight. A cap forms, skins and foam press upward. A soft fizz nips at the ear when all else is quiet. The stranger has you punch the cap down twice daily with a clean plank, not too hard. He shows you the way a pithos breathes when a clay lid is set slightly askew, how the warm air licks the rim and returns with the smell of resin where the seal will later be painted. He instructs you to keep a record on the wall, not poetry, but tally. Day of pressing, day the cap sank, day the lid was pitched tight. You write with soot and spit and mind where you will be in a week. No one speaks of gods in the high tone. The teaching comes as a run of accurate directives. When liquid calms and clears a little, he siphons with a hollow reed into a smaller amphora so the thick settles separate. He warns you against greed. Do not chase every last drop from the lees, he says, or you will taste the impatience all winter. He shows how to paint a ring of pitch around the inner lip and set the stopper so it seals without being stubborn. He works with both the silence of craft and the kindness of one who assumes you are already half taught. At the well he asks for clean water and a wide-mouthed mixing bowl. Wine, he says, is a strong thing. It wants company. He pours a measure into the crater and then 2 measures of water, and he pauses until the idea settles. Depending on the jar and the thirst, he adds more water. 1 to 3 is prudent for conversation, 1 to 5 for a long day. You taste and find something surprising, not weakness but a shape that makes sense. The roughness falls back, the flavor walks forward. He has you name the ratio aloud, as if you were learning to tie a knot. The first day of sharing is not called a festival. It is only neighbors and shepherds coming to see what new jars mean. They arrive the way news arrives in the countryside, in pairs, with dogs that circle and settle. They notice the cleaned press, the pitch line on the pithes rims, the crater waiting like a small pond. You set out cups of differing depth, because farms never own sets. The stranger stands back, letting you be the one who ladles. He has you mix in the open, where everyone can watch water meet wine and become a third thing. He does not correct anyone's words. He watches with the attention of a man who has already learned what happens when a rule is not yet a rule. The shepherds drink and are pleased. They talk about the way the drink climbs behind the nose and leaves a sweetness at the tongue's edges. They salute the way the body warms from chest outward like a hearth catching. They begin a small song that is no more than a vowel rising and falling in contented breath. You notice how their cups empty faster than yours and how their talk loosens past prudence into a careless harmony. The stranger's gaze moves from the crater to the well and back, as if counting without numbers. He murmurs about the importance of water, but the tune at the gate swells and steps on advice. Someone decides to try the pure wine that sits in a smaller amphora under shade, the freerun saved back. It is darker, cleaner, stronger, a kind of liquid too confident for its size. They laugh and praise, and the crater is briefly forgotten. The stranger, still silent, sets his palm on the well's lip as if to ask a favor of it. Aragon brings out bread and olives to slow the mouths. Maera, uncertain about this new, bright mood, circles until she lies down under the press's beam with her muzzle on her paws. Afternoon heat drops. The shepherds' faces shine with a new sheen. Their talk trips and rearranges. One sits then stands too quickly. Another sings a line and cannot find the next. A third, young, proud of his steadiness, has a laugh that comes late to jokes. The stranger lifts the ladle and begins to pour water back into the bowl, resetting the ratio with patient hands, but the men, now certain of their happiness, take cups from the smaller amphora because newness argues for itself. You can feel, in the way the yard's sound tilts, the exact moment when instruction loses its audience. And then, because bodies always teach what speech has not, the surprise begins. A man leans to spit and misses, his mouth remembering a different place than his feet. Another grows pale, unaccountably sad, convinced a dog that has not moved has moved. A third glances at his hand as if it were rented. A headache announces itself in the tone that means tomorrow, not now. In a world without a shared word for this particular change, the way strong wine undoes balance when taken neat, suspicion arrives quickly, phrases stiffen, eyes narrow toward the jars. A few men, ashamed at their own miscalculation, look for another cause to carry the blame. You notice Mera rise and stand between Eragon and the visitors with a dog's simple geometry. The stranger steps no closer and no farther, as if he were trying not to cast shadow on a hanging scale. The well waits, the crater waits, the diluted bowl breathes its temperate breath. Somewhere, a fly's path thickens the air's quiet. A cup tips in a hand that still thinks it is steady. In the courtyard of an ordinary farm, with tools and measures set out in clear view, a new craft has outpaced the words that might have made it harmless. When men cannot name what the body does, what story will they tell about the jar and about the one who poured it? The shepherds' faces settle into the hard mask that follows a mistake no one wants to own. One rubs his temples as if to scrape the ache away with his palms. Another squints at the jar as though it had learned mischief while no one watched. They were cheerful an hour ago, now they are afraid and embarrassed, which is a quick road to anger. A dog barks once and stops, uncertain. The stranger's hand stays on the well's stone lip. He says nothing in the high tone, he says only, "Water first," and lifts the ladle. No one listens. What follows is not a tale of malice. It is a list of small, practical misreadings. A man who has never met unmixed wine believes his legs have been harmed. Another, who prides himself on steadiness, resents the floor for leaning. A third mistakes the slow tilt in his sight for a trick played by the host. They talk past the crater to the stronger amphora, and the talk hardens. The farm, which has always been a place of scale and clarity, two pithy, one press, a dog, a well, suddenly feels too crowded with intention. The stranger steps back exactly one pace, as if to take his shadow off the decision being made. Ikarios does what a good householder does. He offers food, he counts cups, he names the ratio aloud as if it were a rope thrown from a bank to those in water. He urges them to sit. The bench, he says, will steady the day. But a man who hates being publicly wrong rarely sits when asked. He finds action. A hand takes a staff, another finds a stone just big enough to feel like purpose. A third points to the jar and the one who poured. Eragon calls for Mera, who presses her shoulder against the girl's thigh as if weight could keep time from breaking. Later storytellers will add heat to this moment. Here it is slow and stupid. No one intends a death. They intend to correct an insult they cannot name. Someone pushes, someone falls badly, someone who meant to bruise swings too hard. Fear arrives at once and disguises itself as certainty. The field beyond the yard takes the men in, their breath rough, their words asking favor from any explanation that hides shame. In the disturbed dust of an ordinary afternoon, with the tools of a new craft still lined up in view, Ikarios is struck and does not rise. The stranger kneels first, less to tend than to understand. He touches the head, the ribs, the wrist where pulse should be, and at each touch his face becomes more impersonal, as if measuring not this man's life, but the distance now set between instruction and its audience. He looks at the crater. He looks at the strong amphora that should have stayed in shade. He studies the place on the ground where a heel turned in panic. Then he stands, washes his hands in a little water, and steps out of the yard without taking the path you expect. He leaves the way he came, with the exactness of someone who has finished a job that will be believed later or never. Silence holds until the dog shivers it. Mera whines, a thin working sound, not a dramatic one, and noses Ikarios' hand, then his sleeve, then the hollow at his throat, as if the right place might wake. Eragon kneels in a slow fold, pressing her palms to his chest as though warmth might migrate. The shepherds are not there. They have retreated into the shallow safety of distance, already rehearsing a story in which jars are guilty and hosts hide harm in sweetness. The yard becomes inventory again because there is nothing else to do. Cloth for the head, water heated, a rope to make a litter, a question about where the nearest ground will be soft enough to take a grave. Night chooses its time. Torches are found and lit. The beam of the press looks like a sleeping limb. A neighbor is sent to fetch her husband. Aragon straightens the loom's shuttle as if to keep the house from unraveling while the body lies on the bench. The girl's face has the dull patience of someone who has learned too much from an afternoon and knows that learning it again tomorrow will be worse. Mara paces to the threshold and back, to the yard and back, tail stiff, a line with a hinge at both ends. The men who return to help Carrie do so with the careful voices of people who want to say the right words and therefore say none. They bring a stretcher from a storehouse used for sick animals. They choose a place beyond the farm where the soil gives easily under a mattock and where a stone can be set upright without boasting. It is not a ceremonial spot. It is simply reachable. In the dark, choices are made by distance and by what ground yields without a fight. The grave is cut clean and not too deep. Winter rains will settle it. A jar's worth of wine is poured for the earth that will hold him, diluted first, by habit as much as by thought. There is a problem that villages know. When a death enters by error, the air thickens with interpretations. If you blame the jar, you must fear every jar. If you blame the man, you must hate your own hands for touching the ladle. If you blame your body, you must trust nothing inside you the next time a headache arrives. The shepherds who struck him will not agree on a single story. They will choose safety in numbers and find it in suspicion. By morning, word will carry to other farms that unmixed wine is a poison men hide in friendly pottery. The mistake will become a general warning, because general warnings are easier to share than instructions about ratios. Aragon's work has no audience. She sets the house in order for no one's inspection but her own. She cleans the basin used for washing the body. She ties the long grass outside the threshold into a neat bundle so that feet will not slip. She wipes the crater and puts it away. She straightens the stoppers on jars, checks the pitch seam with a thumb. When she pauses, it is not to wail, but to look in the direction the stranger walked and wonder, not whether he was what her father said, but whether knowing his name would change anything about the knot she cannot now untie. The dog refuses the house. Mara roams and returns, drawing lines on the land that mean nothing to anyone else. At intervals she digs in shallow scrapes as if to pull the day out by its root. She winds at the places where the shepherds turned and where they shouted and where they learned too late what their hands had done. Aragon watches the dog and feels a new map being written that the old roads will not explain. A path under olives, a cut-through scrub, a stony shelf that looks toward the plain. Each becomes a word in a sentence she cannot yet read. In a few days, the farm learns the dull pragmatics of absence, where the missing shoulder would have lifted the beam, which debts will be forgiven when people understand, which will be enforced with sad faces because seed must still be purchased. A neighbor offers to take the next pruning with his sons, another to mend the trellis that sagged. The well gives water as before, the press sleeps, the dog grows thin. Rumor grows fat. In the demon beyond, a story spreads that a host in Icaria poured deceit in cups. Some say the jar was bewitched, some that the man had found a foreign trick and taught it without measure, some that the god himself had touched the drink so that mortals would learn humility by a hard spoon. No two tellings match in detail, they align in fear. Men avoid diluted wine, which is to say they avoid the crater, the very safety the stranger insisted on, because fear rarely distinguishes what might save it from what might harm it. Aragon takes up her father's staff one morning and follows the dog, not with drama, with the grim, shallow breathing of someone who has decided not to be taught by other people's stories. Mara works a scent and worries it. The girl learns which scuff in dust is information and which is habit, which broken twig shows a hurried body and which shows a goat. She carries bread and a small flask and nothing else, because when you go to look for the end of a story, weight is your enemy. Above the farm, the ground rises in gentle folds toward rock. The path is not much of a path. It is a series of places you would have put your feet anyway. Mara ranges and returns. The sun lifts and tilts. Under a stunted oak, the dog stops and paws at earth, not with the frenzy of an animal finding a living thing, but with the steady insistence of one who recognizes a known silence. Eragon kneels. In the cool soil are signs of hurried men, the neat, too shallow cut of a mattock, the small fall of stones where they fetched markers. She smooths the ground with her hands as if smoothing the face beneath, and every gesture says a sentence without words. The girl's hair drops forward. The day lifts its heat a little. There are places in Attica where the plain is close and the world is wide, and there are places where a small acre becomes a universe because no one will share its grammar. Here, Eragon sits with a dog and a patch of earth and realizes that the story has left the farm and entered the city whether she wishes it or not. A death that began in a yard will demand an answer from people who were not there. How do you carry a private correction into public speech when rumor has already built itself a house? And if a god taught a craft that needed a ratio to be harmless, what shape will the city make from a girl with a staff, a thin dog, and a grave no one wants to admit they dug? Morning thins the shadows until the yard becomes a ledger again. Too pithy, a press, a crater rinsed and turned mouth down to dry. You stand with Eragon and the dog and feel how a private loss begins to leak into the city's business. Word travels across the demes in the usual stubborn way. Some say a jar killed a man. Some say a stranger did. Some say a god, offended by ignorance, let men teach themselves a lesson. Fear folds itself neatly into custom. People avoid the mixing bowl, which is to say they avoid the remedy. There is an older Attic habit for public confusion. Take it to an older voice. Delegates go to Delphi. They do not ask for poetry. They ask for instructions that will let houses quiet down again. The Pythia's answer arrives like a list. Honor the girl who found what the city refused to see. Give the dog its share. Remember Icarios not as a rumor but as a right. And most practical of all, teach the mixing of wine so that joy will have joints that bend. A city is many households tied together by advice they can keep. So new practices appear that look old as soon as they are done twice. In one telling, girls are set in swings and rocked under trees, and small wooden figures, light enough to sway, are hung and pushed, a safe echo of a death that must not be repeated. People call the rite the aeora, the swinging, and the name is soft on the mouth. In another, the city places images of Eragon and Icarios on a cart and carries them through lanes where dogs trot behind, and bowls of diluted wine are set where anyone can see the water meet the cup. Nothing is secret. The cure for bad rumor is witnessable method. In time, all of this folds into a season Athenians already know how to keep. In the month Anthesterion, when new wine is opened, the city leans toward Dionysus in 3 measured steps. First, Pythagogia, jar opening, when seals are cut and the year's making is aired. The smell is sharp and resinous, and doors are chalked as if to mark vessels that now breathe again. Second, chose pitchers, when people drink not from a common bowl, but from their own measured jugs, each sealed, each timed, a competition that prizes control more than abandon. Third, chitri pots, when grain stew is set out for the quiet dead, and the city speaks to those who do not answer with a formula that keeps conversation short. Out, you guests, people say when it's done, the Anthesteria is over. Boundary and invitation take turns. Some say the aeora, the swinging, hangs among these days like a small, sorrowful leaf. Girls learn a gentle arc, up and back, the rope tight and then slack, the world made safe by repeated return. It is a form of remembrance that does not insist on a name. It allows the city to carry a sad story in public without tearing private rooms. Children laugh because swinging is pleasant. Adults look and keep their counsel. The rite works because its lesson arrives by muscles. Life keeps by rhythm, grief steadies by repetition, and even dangerous gifts can be taught to move within limits. The dog is not forgotten. At some houses, a bit of bread soaked in wine is laid down on chitri with a murmur for Maera, who did the work that speeches could not. In a few versions, because Greeks attach stories to sky the way farmers attach vines to stakes, the 3 are lifted above the weather. Later stargazers will point and say, Eragon is Virgo, Icarios is a herdsman on the long road Bootes, some will add, and the dog is the bright forerunner near the great dog, a small, urgent star that climbs the dawn. Whether the mapping is exact matters less than the intention. Place memory where it rises every year on time. Eragon's house finds quieter practice. She keeps the loom going because cloth is a calendar that minds its own counting. She opens the press in the mild days and scrubs the tray with hot water because tools must not learn neglect. When the new jars are sealed, she marks their rims with a small notch only she can find by finger, a promise that winter will know where to open. At the well, she keeps the mixing ratios in a simple chant: 1:3 for talk, 1:5 for work, more water for heat, and teaches a neighbor's child to say it back like a multiplication table. The men who killed Icarios do not get a chorus. Their part in the city's memory is the least flattering part a man can have. They become the hinge of other people's prudence. No one names them in the rites. Instead, the city names the corrections. That is how Greeks punish ordinary failure, by drowning it in better routine. You hear echoes elsewhere once you start to listen. In Thebes, women climb a winter mountain by rules that keep descent safe. In Attica, villages walk lanes until the map blurs gently and then find their way back by song and cup. In Athens, crowds sit through dramas at springtime, learning to feel together at scale. None of this is frenzy. It is a curriculum for living with loosenings. Dionysus, for all his poetic wildness, seems most at home where people have built containers for him: craters, calendars, processions, swings. The farm becomes farm again. Mara circles the yard with her old dignity and sleeps near the beam when days are warm. Visitors come who have heard 10 different versions and leave with a single instruction: mix, mark, drink where others can see, share bread. You serve from the crater slowly enough that water has time to change the angle of the smell. The neighbors begin to treat wine the way they treat fire and knives, with respect, without drama. Somewhere a boy learns to count the ladles without losing his place to laughter, and that small discipline becomes a town's advantage. In late light, Eragon walks the small path to the tree where the dog found the place she could not ignore. She brings nothing to hang now and nothing to say. The city's rites carry the speaking. She checks the stones settling, presses a heel to the soil the way people test bread, and looks toward the road where travelers pass in a slow grammar of departure and return. You stand with her and notice how the evening makes the Pythes' round shoulders look like hills, how the beam on the press holds its weight calmly, how a mixing bowl, upside down, is only a circle that will be righted when it is needed. Centuries adjust the scene. Names will drift, scholars will tidy, festivals will shift like furniture in an old house as new tenants learn where winter's draft comes in. But the useful narrow lesson stays put. Strong things require proportion and witness. A city that remembers that can welcome a god who loosens without fear of breaking. You put your palm on the crater's rim and feel the faint resin grip, a reminder of the seam that makes keeping possible. Somewhere beyond the low hills, the sea breathes in and lets go again. When, in some other year, someone in a bright place pours straight from a jar and forgets the well, the body will protest in the old vocabulary: a tilt, a heat, a grief without cause. Perhaps the story of Icarios will rise like a low, instructive star at the edge of that person's mind, enough to send a hand to the jug of water, enough to ask for a witness, enough to turn a private mistake back into the ordinary craft of being human together. The swing goes up and back, until even sorrow learns the arc and rests. Story 4, Ariadne's shore at Naxos. You wake to pebble sound and the hush of a small cove, where nets steam lightly in the first sun and an empty amphora leans in sand as if listening. Naxos keeps a habit of calm mornings. A fisherman works a bone needle through linen mesh, counting loops under his breath. A boy rubs pitch into a stopper until the rim shines. A girl brings a wicker calathos filled with sprigs of myrtle and ivy and sets it beside a low post crusted with old garland string. Far upslope, the marble quarries are pale, as if the island had a second dawn embedded in stone. Here at sea edge, the day begins with chores that become rites when repeated: rinse, mend, oil, hang to dry. The cove has a name that is also a story. People call it Ariadne's shore, not because they insist on where exactly she slept, but because a place needs a sentence to carry. The sentence is short. The girl was left. The god arrived. The island remembers both. Down the lane, past the fig whose roots take sweet water, a little Naxos holds a wooden post wrapped in ivy most months of the year. Hooks along the wall keep wreaths a day or two after they brown. 2 clay jars sit in shadow, one for seawater used in rinsing, one for spring water used in mixing. The difference is important and is never confused. This island is full of wine and stone. Vines climb low here, taught to keep their heads down against wind. In autumn they give tight, small clusters that want patience. In winter, trellises look like quiet gestures. The god who walks among vines also loves this shore because arrival by sea suits him. Naxians say he is at home in two directions at once, inland among presses and jars, and outward where all water creases into the harbor. Their calendar holds both movements without argument. You are not here for the chase and surprise poets prefer. You are here for how a village keeps a wedding, and how that wedding rehearses, gently, a loss and a finding the island calls Ariadne. The preparations are domestic and slow. A bed frame is scrubbed and aired on the roof. The bridal himation is brushed and folded. A lautrophoros, long-necked jar for bath water, is borrowed from a neighbor who keeps hers clean by habit, not ceremony. Girls sit with wool and sung words to match the shuttle's pace, a simple antiphon of hymen, o hymene, that is more breath support than performance. The bride's hair is divided and braided low, so pins will not catch on the door lintel. There is a thin, old custom that brides understand without writing it. Before joy, a small sorrow. On the day of carrying, the girl's friends sing a soft lament as if a funeral were being held for her childhood. The sound is not dramatic. It is practical, like the sound of water poured from one jar to another. Mothers approve. They know that a household hands a person across a threshold in stages so nothing breaks. The lament is a hinge. It allows the leaving to be acknowledged in public, so the joining can be clean. At the cove, the bed is set briefly on the sand, not to sleep in but to mark the shore with domestic weight. Older women watch the legs to be sure they do not sink unevenly. A wreath of ivy and myrtle is hung on the Naxos post. Bread is broken small and dipped in thinned wine 1 to 3, someone says aloud, because a ratio spoken near water teaches steadiness. A boy teases by calling the strip of beach a bridal chamber as wide as the world, and is shushed, but the line is not wrong. For an hour the house opens outward towards sea and lets the island's double habit, the sweetness of abandon and the safety of return, enter the wedding like a tide that rises and falls without damage. If you listen for myth, it is present only in errands. A cousin sent to fetch more ivy repeats the joke that Ariadne's crown became stars but still needs replacing before noon. A fisherman remembers that once each year 2 processions cross paths, one that hums a bright tune for a bride, another that sets down a low, almost private song for the girl who woke and found the wrong horizon. Plutarch somewhere will later say Naxians kept 2 feasts for her, one merry, one mournful. Here that information is stored as practice, not as literature. In one season the village serves a honeyed cake and dances the easy, turning steps that release laughter. In another they carry a wreath down to the cove and let it drift until the line grows taut and someone reels it gently back. Both acts are instructional. Both keep a household's edges supple. The men manage the crater where everyone can see. No straight drinking today, the day needs joints that bend. Water from the spring meets wine from a jar marked last and the styrian. Ladles are counted, the rim wiped, the mix lifted so the smell changes angle, resin dropping into background while fruit walks forward. Cups are mismatched, shell deep, saucer wide, chipped, and nobody minds. A small boy is told to call out water before he says wine, and to call the bride's name before he says the bridegroom. He does not yet grasp why order matters. Island life will teach him in bigger ways later. The walk from house to shore is short and full of little tests that weddings reliably impose. A strap threatens to loosen and is retied. A torch under sun looks silly and then useful when a breeze wakes smoke that keeps flies from cups. A pomegranate cracks with a sound like a knuckle. It seeds a tidy lesson in abundance. Women tug the bedcloth straight in a practiced movement that shows they have rehearsed tidiness so many mornings it now reads as love. Talk at the edge sits in the practical register. Someone praises the quarry's latest cut and how the new block will hold a lintel without hairline arguments. Someone else notes how the vines on the lee side gave better this year because wind forgot them. A third recommends keeping ivy crowns in damp cloth until the last moment. It is all housekeeping, which is to say it is governance at human scale. If Dionysus is pleased, it will be because people kept track of small things while allowing their map to open briefly towards sea. And under the chores, the double pulse keeps. The The bride's friends sing a fragment that rises like breath and falls like oars feathered in water. They laugh afterward because tears and laughter share a muscle. A mother touches the girl's wrist the way one checks a knot and, finding it true, steps back. An old man looks at the Naxos, at its ivy cooled by the shade of a poor roof, and nods at nothing in particular. The bed on the sand holds, the legs do not sink. When the hour's shade has shifted from fig to post, the bed is lifted again. The procession curls back toward the lane, leaving the cove neat, wreath hook empty, footprints already blurring where the wash meets stones, a cup forgotten and then retrieved by a child who learned to look back. The house receives its chamber like a tool returned to its peg. The lament has done its hinge work. The song will take over in evening. In stories told elsewhere, a girl wakes alone and a god arrives by surprise. Here the island teaches the skill to carry both versions without tearing the cloth. Tomorrow the wreath will brown quietly on its hook, and next month another will be hung, and in some season distant, the custom itself will be the memory. You stand at the lip of water and feel how the island stores two truths in one shoreline, that a name can be a departure and a marriage at once, and that people, to keep whole, rehearse both. When the next wedding comes, and the bed is set again on sand, just long enough to take the island's measure, which tone will the sea answer first? The soft lament that admits loss, or the low laugh that promises return? Afternoon draws a neat line under errands, and evening begins to assemble itself from ordinary parts. The bridal bath happens without theater. Water from the spring is poured from a latrophoros that has been scrubbed with sand, then smoked a little so it smells faintly of resin. The jar is steadied by an aunt whose hands know how to keep a long neck from wobbling. The girl's hair is loosed, rinsed, braided again in two low ropes so pins won't snag door lintels. A ribbon is tied where the nape is warm. It is less ornament than reminder. Keep the head cool. Inside the house, a bed is made with a care that reads like a manual. A woven sheet is laid tight. A second, lighter cloth is folded lengthwise. A wool blanket is set at the foot, because nights turn even after gentle days. Someone sprinkles dried myrtle along the frame and tucks a small twig of ivy under the top slat to smell green under heat. Nuts and little cakes are set in a shallow bowl. They will be scattered, catechismata, later, not for spectacle, but for the homely wish that food always be plentiful enough to waste a little. A figure of Peitho, persuasion, is hung by the door from a cord. The city may talk loudly about law, but houses keep peace by softer tools. The procession forms at dusk, with the predictability of tide. Torches that look comic at noon now draw a useful circle of light around feet and thresholds. A piper keeps a low, walking tune. He does not show off. The bride walks between two friends. The groom waits a few steps ahead to make the distance small enough that no one stumbles. An elder, carrying a small brazier, walks at the fore and sifts resin on coals, so the path smells sweet instead of smoke bitter. Neighbors step out to their doors, say the names, and return inside to keep kettles from boiling over. The island knows how to mix public and private, so neither tears. At the corner by the fig, the group pauses so women can sing the wedding refrain, Hymen, O Hymene, in a tone that is more breath support than display. A teasing verse is added about a husband who cannot find the right peg in the dark. Laughter rounds its corners until it is kind. The lament from mourning is not repeated. That hinge has done its work. Now the house must learn to receive. At the threshold, small rituals cluster like tools on a bench. The groom touches the doorposts with a sprig of myrtle. A cup, mixed in view at 1 to 3, is handed to the couple together. Each drinks because households begin by sharing a temperature. The bride steps over a low hearthstone placed in the doorway not as test, but as metronome. Pace matters more than bravado tonight. Inside, an older woman lifts the veil briefly, anacalypteria, so names can be spoken toward a bare face. The cloth falls again to keep heat in and nerves quiet. A child is set on the bed and bounced once. The gesture is half prayer for life's continuity, half public promise that the couple will not be lonely if the gods keep them whole. Bread goes round, then olives, then a second round of watered wine. There is no crater hidden in a back room. The mixing sits where anyone can see it. The island learned long ago that safety loves witnesses. A cousin counts the ladles aloud, water first, so the proportions become muscle memory. Doors stay open a palm's width to let cool come through and to let neighbors feel included without crowding. The piper's tune keeps time with chewing. A bowl of pomegranate seeds glows on a tray like a small sunrise. Later, when heat has dropped and voices have softened, the courtyard empties toward the lane and then toward the cove again. The bed remains inside. The couple stays within their lamp's radius. The rest walk the short road back to the Naxos with a wreath that has not yet browned. Someone has carried a little cake studded with seeds, someone else a shallow bowl and a jug. This is the island's second page for the evening. On Naxos, they keep Ariadne in the same breath as Hymenaeus, without letting one swallow the other. At the post, the wreath is lifted down and replaced, old new, with a motion practiced until it is almost dull. A line is tied to the spent garland and fed to the wash where the pebbles mutter. It drifts, tugs, comes back, like an instruction in how to let go and retrieve without tearing. A piece of cake is set on the ledge. A libation is poured, thin wine into moving salt water, so the boundary between house and sea gets a little conversation and not a command. A man mentions for the 100th time the older telling, that a girl from far away slept here once, woke to the wrong horizon, and that the god made a marriage from her loneliness. Nobody argues about which day that story belongs to. The island solved the problem by refusing to choose. In one season, they keep a merry feast for Ariadne the bride. In another, they keep a quiet hour for Ariadne, who learned how sharp mourning can be. Plutarch, a later voice from the mainland, will tidy it into sentences. Naxos keeps it as practice, which is less neat and more durable. You watch what this arrangement trains into bodies. Children learn that sorrow can be housed next to joy without either curdling. Men learn that mixing is a public act, not a trick behind a door. Women learn that a lament sung at the right time saves effort later. The god who loosens is invited because everything that would fray has already been quietly hemmed. The island, in short, has taught itself to take on water without sinking. Night pushes a little shore wind across faces. Someone begins a round dance in a slow, turning line that favors even steps. Hands hold, then loosen, then hold again. The circle never tightens enough to trap, never opens enough to break. You taste resin under fruit in the cup and think how often the seam is the part that keeps a vessel useful. Far upslope, the marble still glows like a memory of daylight. Down here, the sea keeps its patient black. When the wreath is finally hung for the night, a last errand is made. A boy carries a cup back to the house and sets it on the bed shelf where the couple can reach without searching. He is told to return by the upper lane, not the lower, because the lower holds puddles and shoes are expensive to dry. He obeys. The Naxos door is hooked. Someone checks the knots on the post. Someone else says the names again, the way people test a latch before trust. Tomorrow there will be bread to bake and skins to rinse, and if the wind is wrong, nets to reset farther around the headland. Next month, another wreath will begin its short green life on the post. Next year, the same antiphon will ease a bride through her threshold, and the same soft hour will be kept by the cove where story still rides the wash. The island will keep its double page without argument until argument forgets to visit. You stand a little apart and watch the cove write its quiet lines. A hook, a wreath, a post, a tide, a cup. The sea's breath folds into the shore's breath until it is one continuous exhale. If, as some say, the god came here by water to find the girl others left, which arrival are you seeing now? The one that stayed and made a household, or the one that slips away each night and asks the island to rehearse the art of losing gently? Morning returns the cove to arithmetic. Nets hang, dripping in even intervals. The wreath on the Naxos has already begun to dull at the edges. A child sweeps pebble lines smooth where feet scuffed them, and a woman checks the hook's cord, reties the knot, and trims the end clean. Inside the house, the bed is ordinary again. Sheets straight, cups set on the shelf, a wool blanket folded because days will warm. The couple is not on display. The island prefers results to announcements. The wedding scatters into errands that remember it without saying so. The Lautrophoros is rinsed with seawater, then with spring water, then dried in shade so salt won't crust the neck. A cousin returns the piper's reed and leaves a handful of figs on the threshold because musicians eat too. Someone takes the spent wreath down at noon and lays it flat under a stone so the wind won't invent stories with it. The crater is wiped and left upright. The smell of resin sits low in the room like a seam that will never be bowled, always useful. The island keeps its double page without fuss. In one season, a bright feast, cakes cut sweet, a turning dance whose steps never hurry, the tune rising and falling like oars. In another, the low hour, a wreath set to drift and drawn back, a cup tipped to the wash, a line tied loosely so it will release if the tide insists. People repeat that Ariadne was both left and wed here. They do not choose. They practice both registers so neither breaks the other. It is housekeeping applied to myth. Above town, the great doorway stands on its rock like a lesson in thresholds. The portara faces sea and sky, a stone anacalypteria that reveals nothing and frames everything. In late light, you walk out along the causeway with others, fishermen, children, a bride's aunt carrying leftover nuts in her pocket, and stand under the lintel to let your eyes make ordinary things briefly ceremonial. Water that keeps moving, gulls that keep counting, a horizon that stays where it is. The doorway does not close. It gives a shape to passing. Weddings borrow this stance, so do departures for trade and the returns that follow with salt in their clothes. You notice how the gods' arrivals are managed here, not with surprises but with containers. Wine is mixed in view. Songs have pitches the throat can keep. Processions turn before they overrun themselves. The island has stored danger in small, observable acts. Even joy is given joints. A woman says, without poetry, that unwatered wine and unwatered grief both go bad fast. She learned it from her mother. The phrase has the right weight for a kitchen. Work resumes in the quarries, where marble squares are coaxed from Sleeping Mountain with wedges and patience. Men speak about grain and stress, about how a block will hold a lintel without hairline arguments if you respect the stone's old plan. The conversation rhymes quietly with last night's mixing and the morning's knot. Craft is the island's grammar: stone, vine, knot, door. Dionysus is not an interruption. He is a resident whose room stays swept because he uses it often. You hear other places echoing this lesson once you start to listen. In Athens, they wheel a ship through streets to mark the god's sea-borne arrival. On Naxos, the ship is the harbor itself, and the street is a lane to the post. In Thebes, women climb a mountain by rules that keep descent unremarkable. Here, the sea edge teaches the same pace with pebbles and tide. In Attic villages, a winter cart loops the fields until the map blurs and is redrawn. Here, a wreath travels 5 body lengths into water and comes back with just enough salt to mark the story without making everything damp. The god that poems make loud is, in practice, a set of methods. Centuries will show up and rearrange furniture. A chapel will be built near the post. Merchants from Venice will note the wine and carry some away. Later, other empires will leave their handwriting on stones. The portara will keep its clean refusal to close. The wreath will keep browning in a day or two and being replaced without ceremony. The crater will keep teaching ratios to children who don't yet care about gods and will carry the lesson into kitchens where stock meets water and salt is added slowly. The island's double page will survive because it is stored in actions that serve tomorrow: mend, mix, retie, return, not in claims that need defense. You stand again at the cove toward evening. You can watch the island test itself. A boy is sent to the post with a fresh cord. He fumbles the knot, then remembers to leave a tail long enough to untie with cold fingers. He does not know he is practicing how to let go and take back without damage. A woman carries a cup to the ledge straight line where wash meets pebble and tips a mouthful to water before she drinks. She is not making an offering in the loud sense. She is aligning 2 temperatures. A man wipes the crater's rim and says, "Water first," because his father did. He is not praying, he is preventing. The couple will make a household from this. They will inventory the winter blankets and move cups onto the higher shelf when a child crawls. They will boil pitch and paint it thin on jar rims. They will learn the hours of the spring, when the flow thins and the taste goes flat if you draw too late in day. They will pin a bough of ivy under the eaves so smell will rise in heat. None of this will look like myth, yet it is the only reason myth kept its place here. A god who loosens came to an island that knew how to hem. You think not grandly about modern shores. People still set beds in rooms that smell faintly of new paint and soap. Photos are taken near water. A doorway is found and made to frame faces. Somewhere a small lament is sung inside a big day, a grandmother's quiet, a friend's long hug, so the hinge does not squeal. Somewhere a mixing happens in public view, coffee diluted, spirits cut, tablets halved, so strong things enter human scale. Somewhere a wreath browns and is replaced, and no one calls it worship, only habit. Standing at the lip of the cove, You breathe with the island's two lungs, the intake of a name that left, the exhale of a name that stayed. If every marriage kept a soft hour for loss alongside its louder hour for joining, and if every feast insisted on showing the ratio that makes delight durable, how many nights would grow quieter, and how many mornings would learn to carry their weight without tearing. Story 5. Remembering not to remember, Lethe, Mnemosyne, and the vocabulary of wandering. You wake to the small sound that thin metal makes when a stylus presses it, like rain on pottery, but drier. In a back room off a street in Thurii, in southern Italy, a goldsmith is working before daylight so the hammer won't quarrel with neighbors. The table is smooth olive wood. The lamp is trimmed to a stingy flame. The sheet on the board is gold leaf beaten to the thickness of a breath. He steadies a straight edge with 2 fingers and with a pointed bone tool draws faint lines as guides. His customer waits with both hands quiet in his lap. Between them sits a narrow idea that the dead can be helped by instructions so small they fit under a coin and so durable they outlast argument. He is making a lamella, a little plate of gold that will be folded, sometimes rolled like a narrow scroll and laid with a body. The text is not a poem for fame, it is a memo for use. The letters mark a path for the soul to walk when breath is gone. The words are Orphic by habit and by association. They speak of a god who is called Bacchos among the blessed, of springs under the earth, of forgetting that saves one kind of life and remembering that saves another. They are cut in lines that remember hexameter without obeying it. Nothing here needs to please a crowd. You watch the craft as a kind of worship. The goldsmith lays the leaf on lead so the point will not tear through. Each letter is a series of dents rather than grooves. The tool slides and lifts, barely marking, because force defeats legibility when metal is this thin. When a line is finished, he dusts it with chalk, taps from below to lift any sag, and blows. The room smells of warm oil and old wooden drawers. On a tray to one side lie earlier plates waiting for string, one from Hipponion with a warning about a spring on the left, another from Petelia namming the right-hand path that leads to water that remembers, another from Crete that calls the soul blessed, if it can say the correct sentence without stammering. You do not need all the texts to see the pattern. Among the rivers below the earth, there is Lethe, forgetting. Nearby, there is a pool or lake of Mnemosyne, memory. A person trained in life can pick the one that makes sense for the way they hope to live again. Lethe is a practical kindness in one register. It erases, it unties grief, loosens rancor, makes room for a life not crushed by its own past. In the underworld, according to old talk, most souls drink from it and go on as if panic had never taught their bones to flinch. But the tablets advertise a different business. They say, avoid the spring that slakes easily and removes everything. Ask instead for memory. Name yourself as child of earth and starry heaven, an identification that is less pride than password, and ask for a drink that keeps what ought to be kept. The guardian at the pool answers those who have the sentence. The sentence, like a knot, must be tied exactly once and not picked at. The goldsmith works to that end. He writes in a hand that an underworld clerk could read in low light. He leaves no flourish to tempt a novice to follow the mistaken flourish instead of the letter. Where a word must be split at a line's edge, he exercises thrift. Where the dialect of the town prefers one vowel, he uses another if that is what his exemplars did. Consistency is a kind of bridge you should not move after it has worked 3 times. He punches 2 holes at the end so a thread can pass. When the plate is folded, the letters face inward to protect them from sweat and salt. A smudge is a theology problem. A woman in the doorway says she will sew the tablet inside the shroud. The priest says it must lie on the chest. An older man says his cousin had such a plate placed by the tongue so the words would remember the mouth's heat. All these placements have been used. You understand the logic behind each. On the chest to keep the text near breath, by the tongue to keep it near speech, stitched into cloth so that, even if theft takes the ornaments, the instruction survives. Archaeologists in a later century will find them in all these places, at Pellina, at Pharsalos, at Thurii, rolled, folded, intact, or bent by the weight of the ground above. They will read the same advice like a road sign that persisted across weather. Go not to the left-hand spring under the white cypress. Go to the pool of memory and ask by name. Mnemosyne is not only underground. She is also the mother of the muses, the reason choruses can remember steps at dawn, the keeper of meters that make breath cooperative. She keeps recipes for glue and the order of knots. She holds the ratios at the crater, 1 to 2 for God, 1 to 3 for men. Dionysus, the god whose festivals teach loosening without breaking, needs her as badly as the soul does. Without mnemosyne, a chorus becomes noise, a procession a crush, a rite a rumor. With her, even forgetting can be a skill. The lane that blurred safely last night will be drawn straight again tomorrow because someone remembered how to do it. The lamella tells the dead to say, "I am parched with thirst," and to ask for the cool water by the poplars at the lake of memory. Parchedness here is not a melodrama, it is a condition every traveler knows. The instruction is dull on purpose. In life you learn to state needs plainly at doors, to say your name before your request, to mix water in view. In death, the method persists. Identify yourself, state your need, show you know the rule of the place. The promise tucked into the plate is modest and large at once. To join those whom the poems call blessed, to travel by the sacred road as one who has not misplaced the map handed down in breath. You think of Lethe again and admit its mercy for those who do not wish to carry the full weight of yesterday. The tablets are not insults to that mercy. They are an alternative offer to keep the memory that turns a person into someone who can walk a difficult path with steadier feet. The dead who carry such a script do not boast of knowing mysteries. They rehearse a sentence about being the child of earth and sky and about which spring to choose. If there is a theology here, it is a Clark's theology. Obey the signs, ask the right gate. When the plate is finished, the goldsmith lifts it with a spit-wet finger, reads it once, and folds it as if closing a small hinge. The thread passes, the knot is tied with an economy that will not open by accident. He sets it on a cloth beside a tiny sprig of ivy, not as ornament, but as scent to keep moth and fancy away. The customer touches the edge, as if to teach his hand to know what his mouth will need to recall, and thanks the room with the kind of voice people use in places that keep order without boasting. Outside, the street remembers its errands. A boy runs past with a pail, a woman counts figs into a shallow basket, a porter leans a plank to soften a step. You carry the quiet thought that this small piece of hammered instruction has joined the city's other methods for not getting lost. Ropes that become aisles when lifted, ledgers that make gratitude portable, masks that turn voices outward, knots that remember how to release. If a god of loosening is truly kind, he will want his worshippers to be good at both forgetting and remembering, at leaving rancor behind, at keeping the craft that made joy safe. At night, when the house is washed and the lamps set low, the family will sew the plate where they agreed and close the shroud with the same patience the goldsmith used. Breath will go, the path below will open with its habitual forks. If you found yourself there, with 2 springs and the need to choose, and if the memory of a sentence sat close but not yet on your tongue, would you trust your thirst, your training, or the quiet pressure of a knot under your fingers to help you say the right words in the right order? The next day, the Goldsmith Street replaces its hush with errands. You walk past a stall where a woman sells ribbons of linen dyed pale with sumac, good for binding hair, better for wrapping tablets so letters don't learn the sweat of hands. A scribe sits with a boxwood tablet, cutting practice strokes in wax, short verticals, slanted breath marks, little circles that will become microns when sharpened. Memory is being manufactured all along the lane in small, unproud ways. You step into a stonecutter's yard where steely lean like obedient doors. The cutter traces a name with red on smooth marble, then follows it with the chisel. Funerary verses here are brief and domestic. Who tiled this roof? Who left 3 children? Who learned to keep accounts straight? On one slab, ivy curls along the border in low relief. On another, a woman holds a small lidded box, cosmetics, maybe, or ribbons, or letters. The daily tools are carved to keep their user legible in memory. You see the same principle that shaped the lamella, not fame but function, a way to be recognized at the right gate. At a potter's, a shelf of white ground lekithoi waits for oil and a quiet place by a tomb. Their thin painted scenes, women bringing baskets, youths leaning on staffs, hold postures that teach the living how to visit their dead without untying themselves. The oil carried within will be poured in a small, precise arc. The pot, once emptied, often stays as a token of order kept. A boy tests a wick in a clay lamp and counts his breaths until the flame steadies. His mother nods without looking, her hand already lifting a second wick for tomorrow. The house trains memory in meters, the length of a breath, the span of a wick, the rule that oil goes to the dead and bread to the living. A magistrate posts a notice on a wooden board. The day of amnesty for minor fines will be observed at month's close. Old debts, if brought with witnesses, can be forgiven with a chalk mark and a handshake. Public forgetting, written down, is a civic version of lethe. It keeps a city light enough to walk. You remember the lamella's different bargain, to forget selectively, but see how both belong to the same family of tools. A polis that does not sometimes erase becomes brittle. A person who only erases becomes fog. Toward evening, you follow a thin procession along the road to a necropolis outside the walls. There are no grand claims, only a series of repeated gestures that learn their own comfort. Lautrefort, carried for those who died unwed, oil poured and the pot left, small cakes broken and set in 3 places, a cup tipped so a stain forms and dries, as a reminder that things were done in order. A man ties a ribbon to a cypress and trims the ends square. A woman wipes the rim of a mixing bowl and says, "Water," first in a voice scarcely larger than breath. The dead, if they listen, are being given a map written in acts. Back in town, a rhapsode recites lines that have lived by other mouths for generations. He doesn't glance at a written text. The meter, hexameter's calm rope, keeps him from wandering. When he pauses, a kithara player takes the beat and hands it back. Memory here is a duet of body and habit. The audience, many of whom cannot write, possess the story because their feet have kept time for years at this pitch. The muses, daughters of memory, earn their living by packing. You think about other forms of trained remembering that hold a city together. Jurors swearing an oath in phrases polished smooth by repetition. A herald listing tribes and winners at festivals. Choruses keeping their turn through winter practice. Rope keepers calling left of the fig seller's lintel instead of left, so corners become names. Mnemosyne works best when she is almost invisible. She is a pattern felt in the hand before it resolves into words. And then there are the bone-deep habits of forgetting. A woman at her doorway throws a splash of water on the threshold each morning, never thinking to name the act. It keeps dust down and memory from caking into grievance. A merchant turns the tally stick and wipes yesterday's chalk with his thumb. He isn't refusing to remember, he is preventing the account from becoming a mood. At month's end, a chorus is allowed to lay aside a tune that never truly fit the voices. Nobody calls it failure. Lethe, practiced correctly, is not carelessness. It is the removal of unnecessary friction. The priest from yesterday steps into the goldsmith's room with a pouch of little plaques ready for punching. He lays out his models. One text tells the traveler below to avoid the cypress-bound spring and to ask, with the formula about earth and sky, for the other water. Another adds a phrase about a sacred road the blessed know. A shorter one from a different city gives fewer instructions and more praise. You notice the conservatism of the craft. The lines change little across regions and years. This is not the invention of new truth. It is the maintenance of a working path. The letters are small, so they cannot be improved casually. The goldsmith explains which parts of the sentence are not to be altered, word order, the self-identification, the request for memory, and which parts can bear local dialect without confusing the gatekeeper. He trims the edge of a plate so it will fold into 3 without cracking. He hums an indifferent line of song as he works, his mouth remembering what his hands do not require. The customer, a woman with a braid looped twice, sets coins on the table and asks whether to place the tablet by the tongue or sew it over the heart. The priest answers in practical registers: tongue if you trust the shroud, heart if you fear thieves. Use a knot you can teach with a child's fingers. Elsewhere, guardians of other mysteries prepare different maps. At Eleusis, initiates will learn a sequence of sites and acts, drinking kykeon, carrying bundles, walking torchlit routes that write themselves into muscles rather than onto gold. The lesson there is similar: enter, watch, do, return, and allow tomorrow's grain to be the doctrine you take home. Dionysus and Demeter share this economy of instruction. Their rites are brief, their effects are long, and their language is often a list of tasks. You visit a small archive kept by a literate association that lends readings to those who ask. On a shelf rests a set of wax tablets copied from older copies. No one claims originals, containing versions of the underworld instructions, short hymns for use at baths and doorways, and a recipe for glue that will not sour in damp air. The keeper lets you hold a stylus and copy a single line to feel the pressure memory takes in the hand. You etch the sentence slowly, awareness traveling from finger through wrist to shoulder. The line emerges crisp because you do not hurry. Mnemosyne likes the pace of a careful scribe. In a corner stands a box of lost things, seals whose images have worn to sympathy with a thumb, cheap rings, a bent bronze pin, a small coin scorched on one side, two little limella found by a farmer and given here instead of back to the ground. The keeper says he copies their words and leaves the metal unbent, then stores them in cedar until a relative can claim them or until they need to be buried again with reverence. This is a community's version of remembering not to remember. You acknowledge, you record, you do not circulate. At supper you sit with a family who keep neither gold tablets nor grand ideas, only neat habits that behave like both. A bowl is mixed in view. The eldest names the ratio. Bread goes first to a child, then to an older neighbor with a cough, then to the table. After eating, the head of the house takes a small cup to the courtyard and tips it towards soil, not as a performance, but as a punctuation mark. This day, like this line, is complete. The cup is set mouth down to dry. The gesture is unremarkable and precise. If the dead watch, they are offered coherent company. Night falls with the patience of a lamp trimmed correctly the first time. In a room you have begun to trust, the lamella intended for tomorrow's burial lies folded and threaded, ready to be sewn where the family chose. You think of what the soul is supposed to say, who it is, what spring to avoid, which water to seek, and how modest an achievement it is to keep such a sentence present. No thunder, no conquest. A clerkly perfection, a line remembered because it has been paired to only what is needed. Outside, the wind from the gulf smells of tamarisk and old ropes. Somewhere, a boy practices a meter with his heel on stone. Somewhere, a chorus relearns a corner of a tune that went ragged last year. Somewhere, a rope keeper says, toward the fig seller's lintel, and a crowd becomes a path. If in some future century, the gold plates corrode, and the wax tablets melt, and the names on steely fade, which version of mnemosyne will hold longest? The metal instruction folded near a heart, the body's memory of a pace and a ratio, or the city's habit of mixing where everyone can see. Morning sets a clean edge on the gold. The plate lies folded and threaded on a square of linen that still smells faintly of sumac. You stand with the family while the women wash the body in water poured from a lautrophoros, careful as accountants. The hair is combed and tied low so pins won't quarrel with a doorframe. Oil touches brow and wrists. The tablet is sewn where they decided, over the heart, stitches small enough that a thief's fast hand would prefer the visible ring to the hidden sentence. The knot is the one the priest recommended. 2 turns, a bite, a pull that only opens when you ask it politely. The procession is thin, quiet, and instructional. A boy carries a lamp and counts his steps to keep flame steady. A neighbor balances a basket with bread enough to waste a little, the untidy sign of plenty. At the gate, a cup is lifted. Water meets wine where eyes can see it. A ribbon of ivy is tied to a cypress and trimmed square so it will read as intention, not wind. The grave waits at a distance chosen by habit, not decree, far enough for the house to dry its eyes, near enough for feet to remember the route without thinking. You are not shown mystery, you are shown a list made into tenderness. At the edge, the little acts line up like good letters. Oil is poured in a narrow line that leaves a soft crescent on soil. Bread breaks, 3 pieces placed without commentary. A cup tips. The stain widens, dries, and becomes an ordinary ring that the weather will take. Words are brief. Go by the right-hand spring, someone murmurs, not because the dead can overhear through cloth, but because the living teach themselves the tone they will need when their own mouths are dry. The tablet's metal does the rest, identifies the bearer as child of earth and starry heaven, requests memory's water, promises to walk the sacred road because the sentence is complete. You imagine the way below not as a picture but as a workflow. The fork happens, habit answers, left is easy forgetfulness, right is the pool kept by guardians who prefer exact speech. The correct line, small as a tag on a shelf, turns a stranger into someone expected. The water is not dramatic, it is the precise temperature of relief. The map continues. The soul joins those who rehearsed, not with pomp, but with competence. If there is judgment, it notices method. The way breath was paced in life, the way strong drink was diluted in view, the way a chorus held a corner in winter, the way a family folded a sentence into cloth and tied the knot that opens only when asked. Centuries add themselves like thin layers of pitch. The grave settles. Rain writes its own cursive through soil. The lautrophoros at the head tips and breaks. The shards learn patience. In another age, a worker's spade strikes something that does not ring like stone. Hands call a supervisor. A brush takes over from the spade. The folded plate turns up in dust and answers light with a dull, stubborn gleam. In a field notebook, a few letters appear, child of earth and someone makes the low sound scholars make when recognition stands up politely. Drawers in a museum teach the rest. A curator lays this plate beside other platelets from Hipponian, Petelia, Pharsalos, Pelena, Crete, Thurii. Variants aligned like dialect under one grammar. On one, the warning about the left-hand spring sits beside a sketch of a white cypress. On another, the promise of the sacred road keeps company with the same family formula. On a third, praise thickens where instruction thins, and still the gate words hold. The lemella are small enough to be lost, large enough to make a discipline outlast fashion. Visitors read the translations and nod at the odd dignity of a password that is also a biography. Back in houses, the same economy survives without gold. A cook whispers a recipe to a child and taps the spoon twice at the rim so the ratio writes itself into muscle. A nurse folds a note beside tablets that must be taken when a bell says so. She circles the hour and wipes yesterday's circle away, public forgetting that keeps a household light. A clerk on a tram says her pin under her breath and laughs at the strangeness of keeping a soul's sentence in a phone. A stage manager lists cues, then lists them again, and the show lands like a cup set mouth down to dry. The city, any city, lives by small, legible orders, water first, names before numbers, aisles that are ropes until lifted, masks hung by straps, faces turned a finger's breadth to find the upper bench. Lethe keeps her uses. You feel it when a quarrel is left to cool and not reheated, when a record is expunged for minor stubbornness, when grief is allowed to stop gnawing a particular day. Mnemosyne keeps hers. You feel her when you find your way through a dark room by counting the steps you learned last winter, when your hands fill a bowl with the right mixture because someone said it aloud within your hearing, when a sentence you have never written still turns in your mouth as if it had been folded there. The gold tablet does not argue against forgetting. It argues for remembering exactly enough to choose. Its theology, if that is not too generous a word, is administrative. Put your name where a clerk can find it. State your need. Follow the sign. Walk the road you rehearsed. Carry only what makes you fit company. There is kindness in such dryness. It is the same kindness you found in the mountain's rule about soft knees, the theater's chalk line, the ship's wedge, the storehouse's left turn knot, the traveling bowl set under a lintel. Everywhere, a god of loosening was kept safe by measures that quieted pride and made joy durable. At dusk, the goldsmith closes his shutters. The sumac-dyed ribbon is rolled tight and set in a drawer. The bone stylus is wiped and set across the glue pot like a bridge. A speck of chalk sits on the table like a pale moon that has learned not to wake the house. You walk home along a lane that remembers your feet and pass a doorway where a woman tips a little water to the step. She does not watch it darken. She knows it will. She sets the cup mouth down to dry. The day ends on the right spring. Later, when sleep loosens the edges of your room and you find yourself in a landscape with too many paths, you might reach for the sentence you practiced, the smallest knot of self and instruction you can carry, or you might simply hold still until the gate appears that recognizes your breath. Either is a craft. Either will take you along a road someone once described as sacred, though to you it will feel like walking home by a route that keeps its own light. And if you listen, the chalk still whispers on stone, the cup turns itself over, and somewhere a thin plate warms under a thumb as softly as a moth, as if memory, like a river taught to forget its noise, was smoothing the pebbles one by one.